and go to Mark 8. And we're going to bounce back and forth today between Mark 7 and Mark 8. And this should give you a picture, something that we do not talk about very often, but I think is vitally important to you and I as a Gentile. Because this was written to you, to me. And so we'll start off in Mark 8, the very first verse, and it says this: "During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, 'I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, because some of them have come a long distance.' His disciples answered, 'But where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them?'" So, you may think this is the story of feeding the 5,000, but it's not. It's a different feeding. It's the feeding of the 4,000. So in verse 5, Jesus asked, "How many loaves do you have?" And Jesus asked. Now, Mark, I found out, has been attacked for centuries as being a gospel that had copied Matthew, that had a lot of irregularities in it, and things that just didn't seem to be accurate. And so scholars over the years have downplayed this. And one of the things that is coming up recently is this notion by the scholars that there's only one miraculous feeding. It's the feeding of the 5,000. Well, there's another story about feeding 4,000 in there. How do you get that? How do you say that these are the same events? See, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all four give us information about the feeding of the 5,000. But only Matthew and Mark discuss the feeding of the 4,000. And so it just amazed me that this is going on out there. And when you discredit something that's in God's Word, you're discrediting the whole Word. How can you believe any of it's true? So, that brings us to, why are they saying this? And what's happening? Why discredit or try to combine both of these miraculous events? You see, both of them happened in a desolate place. There wasn't other food around. There's a lot of people. And they're saying that that these stories are the same because the same things happen. Jesus asked them both times to have a seat. The disciples distributed the food. There was enough for everyone, and everyone was filled. So they come up with these notions that, see, it's the same thing. Well, yeah, it is the same thing. They fed 5,000 in one place, and they fed 4,000 in another. But this is very specific. And it's in Mark's gospel. If you'll turn and look at that, we're going to answer this question. "How many loaves do you have?" Jesus asked. 7, they replied. See, scholars continue to attempt to discredit the Bible, even though they don't realize, and these are biblical scholars, even though they don't realize what they're doing, in my opinion. So, to kind of give you an idea of what's going on here, if we turn back to Mark 6, Jesus fed the 5,000. And you can see that by the red dot. That is where that occurred. We know that's where that occurred by the description of feeding the 5,000. And then after that, after he fed the 5,000, the disciples and Jesus took a little trip to Tyre. And in the feeding of the 5,000, it's interesting that it was done at a time very close to the Passover. And Matthew tells us they used barley loaves to feed, which meant that most likely they were unleavened because it was so close to the Passover. That's what they were beginning to cook to feed the multitudes at that time. So the bread that was passed out at the 5,000 was most likely unleavened bread. It was also most likely that in this area, and being very close to the Sea of Galilee, it was a primarily, if not 100%, Jewish crowd. All Jewish. So anyway, they feed the 5,000, and matter of fact, he tells them, the disciples says, you guys go on, get in the boat, and I'll meet you over at Bethsaida. And they all get in the boat, and he says, I'll meet you there and get in the boat. So they get out in the boat, and this is where the storm comes, and Jesus walks out to the boat, and Peter walks out with him, and they get back in the boat. But they don't go on over to Bethsaida. They turn back around, and near Gennesaret, they disembark there from the boat, and they take off and go to Tyre. So why is this significant? Well, let's go back to Mark 7. Turn back a page, and we're going to hear what happens when they leave feeding the 5,000. It says, Jesus left that place and went to the vicinity of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know it, yet he could not keep his presence secret. In fact, as soon as she heard about him, a woman whose little daughter was possessed by an impure spirit came and fell at his feet. The woman was a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. She begged Jesus to drive the demon out of her daughter. First, Jesus said, first, let the children eat all they want, he told her, for it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs. Now, you want to talk about a diss. He kind of, this is pretty strong, in my opinion, coming out of Jesus, because you think, man, this doesn't show very much compassion. Because what is he talking about here? They're sitting in a room. If they're in Tyre, they have left the vicinity of where the Jewish people are. Now they're in the vicinity of where more Greek people are. Now, there were Jewish people in Tyre, and he was probably in a Jewish home, but this lady heard that he was there. She is not Jewish. She comes and asks for help for her daughter. And he says, lady, can you not see I'm feeding? I'm giving all this information. I'm filling these heads with biblical knowledge, about me and about God, and you're interrupting me. Let me feed these people, then we'll get on, and then we'll feed the dogs. But she says something. She said, Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs. Wow. What a response. That sounds like something my intelligent wife would say, because that's not what would have come out of my lips. Not when you just told me to wait and that I'm a dog, because that's what he called her. He's calling the Greeks a dog, because that's what the Jewish people considered Gentiles. That's what they called them, were dogs. So then he told her, for such a reply, you may go. The demon has left your daughter. Wow, she was expecting to have Jesus come and do this. But he said, it's taken care of. Just go on home. So she went home and found her child lying on the bed, and the demon was gone. Now, from Mark 7:24 all the way through most of Mark 8, Jesus' whole ministry changed. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus came to spread his gospel to the Jew. But starting in Mark 7:24, Jesus took a different path. He's now outside of Israel in Tyre. He's now associating with the Gentiles. Mark 7:24 through Mark 8 is all about Jesus' ministry to the Gentiles. We often think that, the Gentile ministry didn't start till Acts. Jesus did it here. He's already ministering and setting an example for his disciples. Now, one of the things that it says here is, and the demon was gone. How do they know that? Did the lady come back and tell them? As they were leaving town, did they stop by her house? Somebody had to inform them that the demon was gone for him to write this down. So they are associating now with Gentiles. So what happens next? They're in Tyre, up here, and they go up to, it's just off the map, but you can, Sidon. Again, another Greek town. And we don't hear a lot about what goes on there, but we know he stays there for a while. And then they make another trip all the way down into the area of the Decapolis. And the Decapolis is an area that's south and east of the city, or of the Sea of Galilee, that is Roman. There's 10 cities, and those 10 cities were built by the Romans so that if there was ever an uprising, these people that were Romans that lived in this area could amass and take care of any Jewish uprising. We know that from the Romans who documented this. It says, hey, we got to build some communities, and we don't want to build them in Israel, but we want to be close enough that where something happens, we have a way to control that. So these are all Roman citizens that are in this area. They are not Jewish. Now, there were probably a few Jewish people there, but 90% of them were Greek or Roman descendants. So we don't know exactly what area he went to, but we know it was desolate. And when you go to Israel and you look across, and the mountains come right down to the edge of the sea, and you could see by looking at their other terrain how desolate it could be, because it was probably desolate. But the question is, why do you go there? Well, Jesus had a reason for them to go there. They traveled a long way. They traveled completely outside of the Jewish realm to get down to the Decapolis. So let's go back to Mark for just a second in Mark 7. He says, there were some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place a hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, because now a crowd's already gathering. They're already hearing about Jesus. Jesus put his finger into the man's ears, then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven, and with a deep, deep sigh, said to him, Ephatha, which means, be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, and more he be quiet, don't tell people, the more they kept talking about it. And people were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. So now you have a bunch of Gentiles that are going, man, this guy can do some cool things. They don't even think about him as being a Messiah or anything like that. He's just a man who can perform miracles. They do not realize that he is the Jewish Messiah. They aren't even thinking of that because they're Greek, they're Romans. They have no idea. Now, here we are in this area of the Decapolis. It's barren. They're out away from the cities, but people are starting to come in to the area. And now let's pick back up. We read where Jesus asked them how many loaves they had. How many loaves did they have? 7. They didn't have 5 like they feeded the 5,000. It's a different story. To me, this is pretty simple. You've got the journey that they went to from one feeding to another. Who did he feed in the first feeding? Who was it? Jews. Now he's feeding a whole different population. See, they've gone all the way around Israel so that they wouldn't attract any attention. It's just Jesus and the disciples when they show up at the Decapolis. There's not a bunch of Jews that are following him because he did all these miracles. I think that's the reason they went way out of the way to come back down to the Decapolis. And the lady who came and visited him set the standard. He says, now I'm changing my ministry from the Jews to the Gentiles. I fed 5,000 of my people. Now I'm going to feed 4,000 Gentiles. And again, keep this in mind. The Bible tells us specifically that these are the men that were counted. It was a greater multitude than that in both situations because they did not count the women and the children that were present there. They just counted the men. So, he told the crowd to sit down. Oh, wait a minute, he did that in the 5,000. This must be the same story. On the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. And they did so. They had a few small fish as well. And he gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. Now, back in verse 2, we read the very beginning, Jesus says something I think that's very important for us today. Because what does Paul call us to be like Christ, doesn't he? Jesus said back in verse 2, he says, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. He has compassion for them. He says it. Now, when they fed the 5,000, we see the same type atmosphere with Jesus, but Jesus doesn't say, I have compassion for these Jews. Mark insinuates that by saying, that Jesus having compassion, he didn't say Jesus said that, Jesus having compassion for the people wanted to feed them. Here Jesus says to his disciples, man, I feel sorry for these people. They need to eat. A different approach. Because the disciples would be thinking like back in Tyre, this is just a bunch of dogs. I realized we needed to feed our people. We don't need to feed these Gentiles. But yet Christ had compassion on the Gentiles and fed them. So, the people ate and were satisfied. Says the same thing with the 5,000. Coincidence? No, it's just 2 separate stories. It just tells us that Jesus provided for all their physical needs at that time. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples, and they went to the region of Dalmanutha. Now here's where the scholars say Dalmanutha is a made-up place. We've never found a place called Dalmanutha in our archaeological digs. Matter of fact, this word Dalmanutha is not used anywhere else in the Bible. This is the only time it comes up. Now, in Matthew's story of Magdala. And so people think, well, he's just a little off here. He's, just kind of stretching the truth a little bit. But he's very specific in saying they went to the region of Dalmanutha. So they get there. Now, the people ate and were satisfied. And afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls. Now, in your Bible, I would recommend that you circle, underline, highlight that word basketfuls. Because they were broken pieces that were left over. And then they went to Dalmanutha. Now, so scholars have said, well, to make this work, Dalmanutha and Magdala must be the same place. Yeah, we We could do that if we wanted to say that, but that's not what Mark says. He doesn't say Magdala. He says the region of Dalmanutha. So where is that? All right. Well, we're back into the map. They're down here at the Decapolis. They fed who? Who did they feed? Gentiles. His ministry was with the Gentiles. He's setting that example. Now they leave, they get on, they go to the Sea of Galilee, and they cross, and they go to the area of Dalmanutha. Now, it appears, from what we know today, that Dalmanutha was inland a little bit. And here's why I think that is true. A couple of reasons. Area is Magdala. It's close to the sea. It is a fishing processing plant where you caught fish and everybody would bring them there and have them processed, salted and preserved and then shipped all over the Middle East. But inland from there, in between these two high ridges, two sheer rock cliffs, is a place that really hasn't been looked at very closely from an archaeological standpoint, because there is a little city there, and you'll get a chance to see that. And it's really, because we are going to be up on this is called the area of Arbel. And up on there's a synagogue up on top of that, and and when you go up to the top of that ridge, you can look one way and you can see the hills, and you can see the Golan Heights, and then you can see all the Sea of Galilee. It's just marvelous, and it's a sheer drop off. And so it says that they went to that area, and kind of give you another picture of it. This is looking away from it, but this is the little plain of Arbel, and there was a synagogue right in this area where they had a synagogue, and then this is that a lot of the Jews now, or a lot of people, not just Jews, but a lot of people who like mountain climbing and rock climbing, they go here and do their free climbing and all of that. It's very popular. But it's called, the Rock. And then back there in the corner, you see the Sea of Galilee back that direction. And then here's another look at this. Now, here, around the corner, this is a new Jewish settlement, but around the corner here is Magdala. But right up in here, just in the last few years, they've begun to uncover what looks like some type of a town. Just in the last few years. Now, if we continue on, here's what happens next. He says they go to this area, and he says the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. This is the hint that tells us they're not in Magdala, because Magdala is on the sea, and the Pharisees did not live around the sea. That was for the blue-collar workers. That was for the fishermen. That was for the rednecks. Okay? That's where they live. If you were a Pharisee, you didn't even go down to the Sea of Galilee, because you had your water hauled to you. You had different places. So they would have had to live back away from Magdala. Yes, you had to go through Magdala to get there. Like Matthew says, they went to the area of Magdala. Mark's more specific. We went to this other town. And so we now see that there's some evidence that there was a town there. And this makes sense, because he's being now questioned by the Pharisees, and they test him, and they ask him for a sign from heaven. And he sighed deeply. Did you read that earlier? Did he sigh before this? Yes, he did. When they brought this man who was mute and deaf, he looked to the heavens and he sighed. And here he's sighing again. Now, this is not a Nancy Pelosi sigh where you roll your eyes and sigh. This is a I am troubled sigh. It's a look to heaven and then a compassionate sigh. I feel for you. What can I do for you? And here he's saying the same thing. He's talking to these Pharisees, and I want you to understand what's going on. I want you to know. I've spent time with the Gentiles, and they were so receptive of me. And here I come back to you. And you have heard about all these things, about feeding the 5,000, all the miracles I've been doing, and now you're questioning me, and they say, show me a sign. And I'm sure he thinks, oh, Lord, what have I been doing? I've been showing you sign after sign after sign. What more do you want? So he's deeply concerned at this point. Why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Well, he's already given some signs. But the Pharisees are wanting, that sign from the Old Testament. They're wanting a column of smoke. They're wanting the fire. They're wanting a burning bush. They're wanting something that they can see that is outside the realm of the natural world. But he's been doing this, but not for them. He's been doing it for his people who are the rednecks around the sea, and he's been doing it for these Gentiles. So, truly I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Then he left them, got back to the boat, and crossed to the other side. So, now he is here in leaves, gets back to the area of Magdala, and then gets in the sea, and then crosses back over and gets to Bethesda, or Bethsaida, I said they're on Bethsaida, where they were originally going after they fed the 5,000. Now, we're talking several weeks now that they're finally getting back over to Bethsaida, where they had meant to go after he fed the 5,000. But of course, in God's plan, that was all changed, so he could do one thing. Bring his gospel, bring who he is, bring his compassion to a bunch of dogs, to Gentiles. Now that should give us encouragement. Now, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread. This is me. I'm just telling you, I could see this being me. Here we've run out of bread 2 times already. We've had all these basketfuls, right, that we've had left for us. 12 at the feeding of the 5,000. We've had 7 basketfuls at the feeding of the 4,000. And now we're getting ready to leave. Oh, I forgot the bread. This has got to be comical. Here's 12 men who forget that, oh man, we got to have some bread. And they're like, well, we do have 1 loaf of bread. And so, from there it says, be careful, Jesus warned them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Well, they're going, well, wait a minute, we're talking about we're hungry. What's this stuff about the yeast and the Pharisees and Herod? How much yeast did we have feeding the 5,000? Probably none, because it was leaven. When he fed the 4,000, he just said they're loaves. Doesn't say anything that it's specifically a barley loaf. It's just loaves. It was probably bread with yeast. So they've already filled up on all this bread with the yeast, which you think is better than the barley loaves that they fed the 5,000 with? Yeah, the Gentiles got a little bit better food. So, they discussed this with one another and said, oh, geez, is he making fun of us because we didn't bring any bread? What's going on? This has got to be comical in this boat. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not understand or see? Your hearts are hardened, are they? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember? Man, he just took care of them. Overabundance, twice. And now they're worried about, oh, we're going to get hungry because we just have this one loaf. So, again, something interesting and strange happens. And he's going to explain this now. He says, you dummies, listen. When I broke 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12. Well, you got to be thinking that they're going, well, yeah, he kind of took those few loaves and fed a whole bunch of people. And then he says, when I broke 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketful of pieces did you pick up? Oh, 7. Yeah, that's probably, I mean, this has got to be so funny. Now, I want you to, but it is. You got to think that God's up in heaven watching his son and just rolling. There's got to be thunder somewhere in the earth. But Jesus says something here when he's pointing this out about the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. And it's in your Bible, and the dadgum English language gets in our way. Because he says basketfuls. He says it twice. Well, the Greek does use basketfuls, but it's not just basketfuls. 2 complete separate words. Why not use the same dadgum word? He doesn't. He says, how many kophanoa pieces did you pick up? How many spurus baskets did you pick up? 2 completely different words that Mark writes down. Matthew does the same thing. He uses 2 separate words, basketfuls. You see, a kophania looks like this. It's your ordinary flowery basket that holds some things in it. And this is a typical Jewish basket. However, when he fed the 4,000, both Matthew and Mark use this word, spurus. It's kind of like your flower basket compared to your laundry basket. Much bigger basket. Which one do you want to have filled with food? This one or this one? I'll take this one, even though there were 7 of them. And why were there 7? Anybody want to guess why there were 12? What's that?
Didn't hold as much.
Yeah, but there were 12 of them. Why were there 12? There were 12 disciples. How many tribes were there? How many tribes were there? 12. So it makes sense. I'm talking to the Jews. I'm going to leave you 12 basketfuls. But now we're going to go talk to the Gentiles. Why? You understand why there's 12. Why were there only 7 baskets? What does 7 mean? Surely if we're saying 12 means something, what does 7 mean? When the Lord, your God, brings you into the land you are entering to possess and drives out before you many nations, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, 7 nations larger than you and stronger than you. They weren't going to pick up on that at that time. This was in the Old Testament. They had this information. But I do think that the scholar that Paul was, he knew this story. He knew why there were 7. It was absolute confirmation. Where do I need to bring the gospel? To the Gentiles. Jesus was telling them. He was giving them the sign. The scholars knew this. Probably his disciples didn't, because his disciples are what? Rednecks. Bunch of rednecks. They haven't probably read any of this stuff. But Paul does. Paul knows. I just think that was just more confirmation for him. When he got together and he visited with Peter and he visited with the disciples and he talked to them about all the things that went on, they said, yeah, and we had 7 of these Spurgeous basketfuls left over when we had the 4,000. And I think Paul went, you know what? God wants us to bring an overflowing basket to the Gentiles. The Gentiles have the same rights to the power of Jesus as the Messiah in Israel. There's one other little note. If you look at the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus says, I need to feed my sheep. They need a shepherd. He doesn't say that with the 4,000. See, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah, but he's the Gentile Savior as well. And so all of this stuff about these being the same story, no, there's no way. 2 distinct stories to tell us 2 distinct things about Jesus Christ and his compassion. Take care of people's physical needs as well as their spiritual needs. And that's how you be Christ-like. So, it's amazing when you think about it, how 2 baskets and 2 loaves make a big, big difference. Thank you. Questions, comments, things I might have missed?